Sorry, I didn't text you when I got back. What's that?
Looks like maybe, it looks like the folks that joined on Teams are no longer trying to do so. So I think we're okay. All right, we've got a full room in here. I think y'all can see us and hear us. Imogen's, Shelby and Terry can give us a thumbs up if we sound good and look good to you. Awesome, cool. Well, I just want to extend a really warm welcome to all the committee members in the room. Really appreciate you being here. I know what a huge commitment this is out of your year. And so I'm personally just super grateful that you were willing to engage with this plan in such a dedicated way. Imogen, can you go to the next slide, please? And I owe Brendel an apology again, because I'm always forgetting to introduce them. I do want to say that we do have Brendel Group with us in virtually today. They are our climate action planning consultant. And I'll talk a little bit about their role further, and they'll introduce themselves as well. But just wanted to acknowledge their presence, say thank you. Before we really jump in, I just want to do a big notice that this is a public meeting that was in the agenda. We're doing that so that the public has an opportunity to just hear how the plans are developing. We're doing that across all the planning efforts. So if you are joining as a member of the public, which I don't see anybody that is, but just in case this meeting is open to the public, we are not accepting public comment, which is why we chose this webinar structure through Zoom. If you do want to comment as a member of the public, you can go to any of the council meetings. You can contact any of our council members. That can be non-synchronous with any of the planning meetings. You can also comment at any time via email at sustainability@crestedbutte.gov. It's just so everybody's aware of that. Next slide, Imogen. Thank you. Okay. So this is where we're headed today. This is obviously the first meeting. We're just getting started, and I just wanted to level set for everybody on the objectives that we are hoping to meet today during this meeting in these 2 hours. So first, we're going to really help y'all understand what the progress is on our climate action planning so far, and also with the 2019 climate action plan. We're going to help orient everybody to some greenhouse gas emissions terminologies, definitions, methodologies that we're considering for the plan. And then I want to go give everybody an in-depth look at the planning process and how we're aligning with the compass, dates coming up. And I do want to clarify for folks the navigation committee meetings, which are the kind of secondary committee meetings that are running in parallel really with all the planning efforts. So give you a good idea of the schedule and what's expected there. And then this objective I added, just that wasn't on the agenda, but just added here. And I just want to make sure that the what we're calling the CAPC committee, the Climate Action Planning Committee, understands the schedule and their expectations during this process. Next slide, Imogen. Thank you. So hopefully you all are very aware of this schedule by now. I've sent a lot of meeting invitations. Just wanted to highlight that the next meeting isn't until April 25th. And that's on purpose. I know that seems like quite a ways out from this first meeting. We're going to be finalizing the greenhouse gas emissions inventory and really taking the feedback from this meeting and incorporating that into our goal setting. So we can really come on that April 25th date and have a firm goal, as well as really well-defined greenhouse gas emissions inventory findings for you. Next slide. And I know this might feel maybe a little kindergarten-y, but I do just want to start out this committee. And I know that a few folks in the room are pretty used to the public process and used to these types of committee meetings, but I just want to lay the foundation of respect in these meetings. And to me, that looks like active listening, allowing folks to complete their thoughts and share their personal experiences. And we are not going to all agree in these meetings, and I hope that we don't, because that means that we're bringing some diverse perspectives and different walks of life to this discussion. So just want to lay that foundation. So what's expected of this group? I know in the beginning there was a little bit of confusion about what the committee members were really being asked to do as we define these meetings and this process. What we're hoping from the committee is really to help us guide the way on goal setting, define what's important to this community as far as climate action. We call them alternatives, but you call them actions, solutions if you wanted to, based on the goals that we identify. We are really hoping that you folks will help us define the guardrails, or what we call success measures, so we can really prioritize and identify what's material as far as the actions we define that will be substantial to our greenhouse gas reduction goals. And the other last two are, y'all are advocates for this plan. So you folks know what's going to be happening in this room. And while these are publicly attended, hopefully, and we will be providing the recording to the public, you folks will really have a good sense of how the plans are developing, and can talk to people who stop you on the street in this community and ask you questions for that. And then finally, you will also be representing this plan and the objectives of this plan in the navigation meetings, which I'll talk about next. Next slide, Imogen. Thank you. Okay, so I want to get a little in deep on these navigation committee meetings, because it's up to now, maybe it's been a little confusing, but we've gotten some better definitions, some better terminology on these committee meetings. So as you can see by the graphic I've thrown up on the screen, we've got a lot going on this year. And while it may feel really confusing and really overwhelming about the responsibilities of each plan, this is really intentional. The Transportation and Mobility Plan, Historic Preservation Plan, and the Climate Action Plan are all being developed kind of in parallel, because they all inform each other and have important trade-offs in their individual discussions. And eventually, and this will kick off fairly soon, we're kicking off another plan, the Strategic Infill Plan, TBD on that name. There might be a new name for it pretty soon. And these navigation committee meetings, which we were previously referring to as the plan integration meetings, integrated planning meetings, something like that, will be to bring all these committees together and talk about the pros and cons of each plan, how they conflict, how they complement each other. We'd love for you to attend if you can. And as we mentioned, we will be compensating you for attending those meetings. And they will be facilitated. I don't want you to think that you're going to be walking into a room with 4 different planning committees and we're just going to go have at it. We've got a really talented gentleman named Miles from a company called GBSM, who's going to be helping really facilitate those meetings successfully, so we can identify, again, the complements and conflicts between the plans. And you'll really be the ambassador, like I said, for that plan. So when you go into that navigation meeting, your job is to kind of fight for the climate action plan while understanding there are other priorities with other plans. So you should have gotten a meeting invitation, and that first meeting is March 27th from 9 to noon with an optional lunch from noon to 1. So we hope y'all can join us for that. Next slide, please, Imogen. Thank you. All right, now that we've done a little level setting, orienting to the meeting structure, just conduct, I'm ready to get to know y'all. I know I think everybody in this room actually, which is great, but I want you guys to get to know each other. So if you want to do just a short intro, we can go around the room. Give me your name, your professional background, or just your connection with climate action, and your favorite thing to do outside. So I guess I can kick it off. My name's Dana, if y'all don't know already. I have an MEM, Master's in Environmental Management. I have significant waste and compliance experience, and now getting experience in municipal and climate action planning. And my favorite thing to do outside is, well, looking at the stuff outside, snowboard. I think I was gonna say something clever, but snowboarding right now.
I can go next. I'm Megan. I am the climate action planning intern for the town of Crested Butte as well as Mount Crested Butte. And I'm kind of helping them right now with helping Mount Crested Butte a lot with their emissions inventory. And then, yeah, kind of helping with both climate action plans. I'm a junior at Western in EMBS with the emphasis in climate action planning. And my favorite thing to do outside is ski. And I learned when I got to Western.
My name is Giza Michael. I have a postgraduate degree in environmental management many years ago. Since then, I have worked always in energy efficiency, climate, like working for nonprofits all along. And I look forward to being in this group. And my favorite thing to do is playing ice hockey. Currently in the winter.
Nice.
Thanks, Lisa.
We can go back and get the Troy.
I'm Troy with Community Development, and I like going and hiking with my dog.
And that's your role is community development with
Director.
the community?
I
Okay,
am.
great.
Nice to meet you.
My name is Valita Scribner. After a 15-year career in aerospace engineering, about 5 years ago, started the transition into sustainability work, thinking that this planet needs all hands on deck. And I did the MEM with Dana and really honed in on greenhouse gas emissions accounting, climate action planning. And that's what I do today. I'm a corporate sustainability advisor for NG Impact and focus on greenhouse gas emissions accounting, reporting, target setting for all scopes, and feel really fortunate to be able to provide that skill set and energy and passion to this community, which I love so much. And yeah, my favorite thing to do outdoors, I would say, is probably ski uphill to ski downhill, which I got to do with Nicole this morning. So yeah.
That was awesome. That's been great. Beth Goldstone, my role here is I sit on Crested Butte Town Council. Passionate about this work though, and so excited to be here. And I like to mountain bike. The top room. Not the season.
You don't have one of those bikes with the big fat tires.
But I townie biked over here in the snow. It's
Nice.
great.
My name's Melly Emma. I'm the town's long-range planner. I did my undergrad in environmental science, but my career has really grown into planning, and I'm really passionate about kind of the systems perspective of climate action work, how does like land use influence how people move around and transportation, how does it relate to building a sense of community and those community connections too. I did work on the 2019 climate action plan, so I'm excited to bring kind of perspective, what successes from that, lessons learned from that. But on the flip side, this year I'm really involved in the navigation work and then also the infill plan. So I'm really excited to be here to listen and start to put the pieces together on the common ground or maybe tension points between all the plans. So I may be asking some probing questions of you all as this process moves along. And my favorite thing, I love a good powder day, but I think mountain biking is starting to be winter activities.
I'm Donnie Duvall. My background is mostly renewable energy systems. I've worked on wind turbines for about 10 years and then got into solar systems. And so I work for Nunatak Energy here in the Valley for about 7 years now. Hopefully I'll finish the MEM program in May. And through that, I focus more on how we use energy, how much of it we use, and ways to mitigate it, primarily through residential buildings and the embodied carbon aspect of material usage. I'm also sit on the the Beaux-Arts. So I've done that for almost 6 years. So that's, I think, why I was asked to be on this board.
One of a
That-
few reasons,
Yeah,
Donnie.
as a Beaux-Arts representative, but, so I kind of know the historic preservation aspect of things and can lend a hand there too.
Thanks, Donnie.
And I enjoy just being in the mountains, whatever it might be, standing there, moving around, whatever.
Standing in the mountains, got it.
Yep.
That's a good one.
Dara McDonald, the town manager. Super excited to hear all of you. I'm super excited that you're here. So thank you. I know it's a huge effort and a lot of time, so it's really appreciated. And having the energy and voices from the community throughout the process is going to make it a much better plan. As always, and the commitment to do that is really appreciated. I think we're deep in the midst of multiple planning processes, and so ask everybody for a little bit of grace as we continue to work through, especially this integration. And I think when Dana said that you're going to be there to advocate for the climate action plan, I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, because we're all super passionate about this community, but bringing those different perspectives together is really what this is all about. So yes, have a strong voice, but also, recognizing that there's a lot of different perspectives. It's just a cool thing to be a part of. So thank you for that. And I like going on long river trips with my family.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, I'm Nicole Blazer, and many years ago, many years ago, I got a degree in biological aspects of conservation and certificate in environmental studies and a degree in biochemistry. I spent most of my career working for nonprofits in the conservation kind of world, or wilderness therapy, working for groups that educate and work with kids, young adults. And I also spent a big chunk of my life working for the Conservation Corps, which was amazing. Somehow through the whole COVID thing, when life was being flipped upside down, I decided that I wanted to just go another further step. So I started law school online. I'm wrapping up my environmental law and policy degree from Vermont Law. And I work closely with the Gunnison Valley Climate Crisis Coalition, along with these two and this one. And I have chaired what we sometimes call the Regenerative Agriculture Committee, which has been working on some composting things. And there's a lot brewing in that area in our valley. And we just started a community engagement committee that met for the first time yesterday, or that may have been the day before yesterday. And we're going to try to devise a film fest, and we have dreams of figuring out how to better educate our community and inspire our community regarding climate change. And hopefully that will help tie into inspiring on the climate action plan and all that sort of stuff. I'm super excited to be here. So thanks, Nicole. Let's go online. Got a few folks online.
I guess I can start with online. So I'm Imogen Ainsworth. I'm a senior sustainability analyst with Brendel Group and the project manager from our side on the consultant side for the climate action plan. I've been with Brendel Group for 2 years and some months, working on climate action plans, sustainability plans with local governments, education, and ski industry. Prior to that, I was the sustainability coordinator for the city of Durango for 5 years. And prior to that, I got started working in community-owned solar for a nonprofit and a city in England. I'll pass it to Terry and then to Shelby. Oh, and my favorite thing to do outside is trail running. I like running long distances in the mountains.
My name is Terry Hatfield. I'm a senior engineer with Brendel Group. I've been with the company about 5 years, primarily helping municipalities with climate action planning work or energy action planning work. I have a degree in mechanical engineering, and my role on this project is as analysis lead is to head up the greenhouse gas inventory and kind of looking ahead to strategy impacts and what impact that has on the greenhouse gas inventory looking ahead. So like Imogen, my favorite thing to do is out either hike or trail run, kind of a combination, hiking, trail running uphill. kind of one of those weird ones that likes to run uphill. So I will pass it to Shelby.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Shelby Summer. I'm the Director of Planning and Engagement at Brendel Group. Been on the team for about 10 years, and my background is in community planning. So I'm a certified community planner. Also have a master's degree in public administration with an emphasis on local government. So I really enjoy projects like this. It just is really fun to get to work with our engineering and planning and analytics team across sort of our different subject area expertise, and also bring the passion of mountain communities and local government. So my favorite activity is also skiing. So I think we're in good company with folks in the room.
Great. Thank you all on the Brendel side. I thought I saw Maddie on here, but looks like maybe she's not anymore. And Shay, I'm gonna put you on the spot. You walked in right as we're doing intros.
Hi,
So
I'm Shay Early. I'm the Public Works Director for the Town of Crested Butte. I'm not sure what else I'm supposed to say.
professional background and favorite thing to do outside.
Professional background.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was an electrician, an elephant trainer, and a geotech engineer before this, so.
Many lives.
And
Elephant experience
Yeah,
coming in.
coming in here. Favorite thing to do outside, I like backpacking.
Nice. Great. Well, thank you all so much for the introductions. And as you can sense, we've got some really experienced, really impressive folks in the room on both our consultant side and on this committee and even amongst our staff. So a nice split between summer and winter activities, it kind of seems like. So we'll see how squirrely everybody gets once it starts to warm up and we're stuck in here doing committee meetings. Great. Imogen, you can go to the next slide. All right, so I want to spend some time just asking you some thought-provoking questions and really helping everybody understand like why we're all in this room. As you can tell from everybody's introduction, we've got some really passionate folks in the room about this topic. And we're also trying to pull out some ideas for maybe some co-benefits, or we're definitely in the climate action plan wanting to talk about public health. After attending Mountain Towns 2030, I don't know if anybody was able to attend. One of the angles that has been proven to be really effective in speaking to the public about climate change and helping them connect better with it is through the lens of public health. So we're really excited to talk about that. So these questions are meant to kind of elicit some specific responses. So no specific order here. What concerns you about the impacts of climate change? It's near and dear to your heart about the impacts of climate change.
I'll go. I think a major issue is that how there's going to be winners and losers, and it's just going to drive the socioeconomic difference between different groups even wider. And trying to find ways to like bridge that gap for people is important.
Do you want to share a specific example you can think of, Donnie?
I mean, you can think of like, so in the US, we're kind of affluent enough that everyone can afford EVs at some point if they want them. And so you have the battery issues that in Africa, everyone's, that's where a lot of the mining is coming from. And so they're basically digging holes in their floors to mine cobalt. So and then it gets transferred to China and the pollution happens there as production of everything. And then we come here and have clean air because we all drive EVs now.
I think my main concern of many is similar in the like predictions I've been learning in school around like disparities that are predicted to occur with like the number of climate refugees in various parts of the world. Where are those folks going to go? To like where some of the more affluent communities will still have access to food while others are getting less and less and less and less. And so there was a growing disparity gap that I think is being driven a lot by climate change and just the consequences of that being like a lot of civil unrest, a lot of starving people, a lot of social issues. What does that look like to you, Nicole, within the boundaries of Crested Butte?
Right.
Mhm.
Good question.
Yeah.
You know, I think we're of the affluent. And so I think from my perspective, Crested Butteians, many of us are in a position of being able to do something about it. If we're on the primarily, I think the affluent side, certainly not everybody in the valley, but like we're in a position to be role models. I see some of the power of Crested Butte, one, because it's Crested Butte, so it's in the public eye globally and internationally. Like we can be powerful role models for many, many communities around the world.
Thanks for sharing.
One thing that comes to mind is the fact that we're all here because of the things that drive us in life, which are, you know, passion for the outdoors, and that is all, it's all very threatened with climate change. And, you know, we know it's not just global warming, it's global weirding, it's things just really shifting and being unpredictable. Everything from, you know, our surroundings and our air quality being affected by wildfires to, you know, very present, like our changing snowpacks and like changing consistency. And so I know that's, it's broad, but it's both the direct impact, but then the indirect impact of what if we can't go do those things that we thrive on? We already have a mental health struggle here in this community, and you know, if people can no longer do, and you know, near term even, you know, with cycles of climate, of the weather, what are we gonna do if like our both mental health and even potentially livelihood is threatened by the changing climate? So.
I think my biggest concern with regards to climate change is that we have known so much about it already and about the problems, about the issues, and people have not been active. People have been in general, like just inactive about it and just kind of sliding along, and that we are being now driven a lot by these kind of these emergencies that are occurring throughout the world, of, okay, well, I guess we now have to do something. And even with that, there's a lot of inaction still. So, so I think with regards to what we can do here within Crested Butte, I think the climate action plan can create more basically action items to implement and to give solutions, and for not only the town, but for the residents and for the people around to have opportunities to live more sustainably and to reduce their carbon footprint, basically, through different kind of means and measures.
I don't want to get away from this topic too much before folks have shared, but I have seen climate action plans, I think Telluride, where they offer a little bit of a sidebar roadmap for their residents. Like how can you personally take action, which is not necessarily the most important message of the climate action plan, because there are bigger entities that will help us reduce those things. But I'm hearing that maybe some inclusion of that in the climate action plan is something you're seeking.
Might also be a feedback loop to like, you know, impact, you know, more like systemic change, like for example, feedback to our utilities and like, you know, by the decisions that our community is making, you know, to really have some feeling of being able to do something on a larger scale, both individual and how can we like impact the system, you know.
Maybe else want to share? I can share if people want time to think about things.
I was gonna say just, I mean, big picture of that has always been just habitat and species lost, and for future generations not to be able to enjoy the natural world in the same way that I've been able to. I'll just concur with the ideas of community education and involvement. And that example you gave from the Telluride plan, I really agree with that. I feel like general public opinion is a key component of the overall success or failure of a lot of these movements, because it influences politics, it influences lawmaking, it influences voting. People have the power to individually act and choose. I think it's one of the, in my opinion, one of the overlooked pieces in a lot of climate action plans is the community engagement in a positive celebratory way. Instead of like, oh, you must act, or, you know, this, I think that there's incentivization opportunities and ways in which people can be proud of their actions and understand that their actions, not even just individual actions like I recycle or something like that, but their actions within a community as a whole truly matter and are making waves in our world right now. Just doesn't hit media very much yet, but I think it's coming.
Rather than kind of terrifying the community and penalizing the community through speaking of terror, speaking through, you know, what's possible, that more like abundance mindset of here's what happens if we do change. That's great. Thanks. I'll just share that resource scarcity is a really big concern for me. And you know, I wonder, I don't know if I can or will have a family, but if I had a family one day, like what does it mean for them in 80 years? That's something that really concerns me about the impacts of climate change and just for everybody else's kids too, not my non-existent ones. That's what really drives me about climate change. So any final thoughts before we move to the next question? Okay. Imogen, next slide, please. And we're gonna flip it on its head. What makes you hopeful about climate action? What makes you hopeful about the things that we're doing here in Crested Butte or just generally?
Being here in this room right now with all of these incredible humans that are inspiring and driven, and yeah, and the fact that the county is putting resources into actually doing something about it and managing what we can.
I think for me, the biggest hopeful thing is in my studies and things we've gotten exposure to through the schooling I'm in, and which is pretty recent stuff, and some of the travels I've been able to do internationally lately and some different things. I just tend to conversate about climate change and many conversations with many people on like buses going from here to there or whatever. And I feel very strongly, and it's validated by some schoolwork, that there are these little movements happening on small scales all over the world, and that it's growing rapidly. And, you know, I know that a lot of the solutions need to come from very large entities, but I do feel like if enough of these small movements occur, that from this like top down and bottom up, that it actually is possible to move this needle where it needs to go.
One thing I really like that Emily Artale mentioned during her presentation, and for those of you who weren't able to attend, she just noted that the systemic changes always have that tipping point, and it just kind of seems like, you know, things will exponentially, could exponentially change once we start to see that top up or top down and bottom up approaches really start to culminate. So that made me hopeful.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. I think I tend to veer towards hopelessness of our federal government isn't doing anything, but it's really cool to reflect and see how much progress has been made even from 2019 to now. The like utility scale conversation of renewable energy is totally different from our last climate action plan to now with Tri-State and their electric resource plan. And that's really cool to see, and I think there are so many movements happening that's starting to shift, and of course, more work needs to be done, but I think it's really cool to just see how things are starting to change, and while it might feel slow, together, they're making an impact.
There's a book,
Use it.
well, well, there's a book that was written by Friedrich Capra in 1986, The Turning Point. And when I, maybe a little later, I read that and I was like, oh, this is the turning point, right?
When did you read the book?
Well, we're still turning.
Big turn.
Yeah, but I agree. I've done here locally energy work in I've forgotten when this was, 10, 15 years ago. And now the push is harder, stronger, there's more of a collective. And like what I'm hopeful about from my personal anecdote, and I just want to share it, knowing full well that I am like one of the more affluent people in this world. So I got to drive my EV from Gunnison up here, it's brand new, and I charged it while I took the bus to go skiing. And then I came back after 2 hours and it was charged up a little bit. So I was like so psyched about it. That was like the best thing that I feel like the town of Crested Butte has implemented within the past, whatever, 5 years. I'm like, that's so cool. But knowing full well that, this is not for your typical resident in this community.
Right, it's a privilege to be
It's a
able to do
privilege.
that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So to kind of sidestep a little bit, I think one of the major drivers of our climate change is our current society's belief in that we have the ability to exponentially grow and utilize all the resources, and there's no limits to any of that growth. And so hopefully with some population levelization that may change a little bit, but I think we are going to see, in the next, who knows how long it's going to be, a major reduction in the energy ability, the ability to use energy. Like fossil fuels is just going to decrease a lot, and it's really going to change the way we live. But I think because of that, we're going to kind of go back to a time where we believe more in community and we share values and we help our neighbors and we grow our own food and focus on local things. And I think that's going to be a great benefit instead of this kind of technological driven social world that we're in right now, or social media world.
Not sure how this fits in exactly, but there's debates, and I wrote a paper on it around the technological solutions versus the natural solutions. And I think my understanding is most people are advocating for both because of the crisis that we're in. It's like, let's just do everything we can.
All of the above.
But it's just, it's an interesting reflection, and that's all I'll say about that now, but it's interesting some of the things that came out of that class.
And the technological advances will definitely speed up the snowball of us being able to adapt and transition and change. And so yeah, we can all feed into each other.
Natural solutions being, I think, a lot of what you're touching on. Almost, it's not called de-evolution, it's like a buzzword.
It's like traditional ecological knowledge, like that memory that we had from thousands of years ago of how to live in harmony with the earth. We've kind of separated from that and based on technology. And I think technology is going to have a lot of great possibilities and good things, but a lot of problems with technology is that it uses more energy and kind of drives it. And so there's this entropy issue that we're always trying to have to control things. And so it's simpler is better sometimes.
And we'll see some of the natural solutions as part of the resiliency component that this plan is looking for. It's like when stuff's, if and when and how stuff starts to come down more and more and more, resiliency may have to do with a lot of the natural solutions. Like, where is the food going to come from if the system breaks down? Where is the clean water gonna come from? Community coming together in a lot of those solutions.
What else are we hopeful about? Nature-based solutions. Momentum of change.
Yes, this is a little different, but I would love for us to think about, sometimes I tend to just think of like, what's the final product of this plan? What's that checklist of projects? But I was reflecting on the last plan and how the process was almost more important than the plan itself. And like having GCA at the table, I feel like really gave them the momentum where now they have climate action in their strategic plan and they have a committee and they're doing all these things. And how can this plan be a like process to really build momentum beyond just what does the final document look like with the education opportunities you were talking about? I don't want us to lose sight of that.
Thanks for saying that, Mom. Okay, I think we can maybe go on to the next question. All right. So I want to know, and Brenda wants to know, aside from greenhouse gas emissions reduction, what other topics would you like to see the 2030 climate action plan address? And I just want to maybe provide some context for this question. So last fall, staff went to council and said, what do you want to do? We have this climate action plan that focuses only on greenhouse gas emissions. Do we lean more towards what other communities are starting to do and include things that are more what folks are calling sustainability topics? So things like water, food, other topics that absolutely deal with the climate, but are not necessarily greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategies. What I want you to also consider as you're advocating for certain topics is that there, like Donnie said, there are only so many resources available to the town, right? So if we start to really tack on food, water, I don't know, I'm blanking on other topics, but the more we add, the more distributed our resources will be. So that'll be an important conversation as we start to look at other communities' best practices and what we want to take from this. So I'll leave it at that and hear what y'all have to say.
Okay, oh, sorry.
No, it's okay.
I
My
just think-
started with
no,
my hand.
I'm just curious, like at first, like, you know, a lot of these things, there's also Mount CB that's working on stuff and Gunnison County that's working on stuff. And I think it's worth kind of knowing like where we can share resources. So we're not all working on like food and water, but the county's working on it too. So we don't need to focus that much on it kind of thing.
And maybe there's a way that rather than tacking on additional items, you can just have other implications and focus areas in mind. Like, for example, I love, you know, I really appreciate the community compass as being basically like an outline of things that we want to continue to focus on when making decisions. So like, for example, thing that always comes to the top of my mind is housing equity, you know, and so when we're making climate action planning decisions, how can we think about it, you know, about the implications to housing equity? That's the first thing that comes to my mind, but I know there's a million.
What I want to also remind everybody of is of the other plans' responsibilities, right? We should be intentional about the scope of the 2030 climate action plan. We're going to talk about resiliency today and what other communities are doing as a best practice versus what other plans are kind of tackling in our community and how we can talk about it in the climate action plan without creating an entirely new scope in the climate action plan. So when we talk about housing, we can also think to the strategic infill study, which will really help us to define how we're going to build our community. So a question to y'all is also, and something we've been thinking about during the process, is how deep down the rabbit hole do we go on each of these topics, knowing that there are other plans that will give us tactical solutions to those problems without, what am I trying to say? Distilling down, duplicating efforts. Yeah, just minimizing the climate action plan. And that's not what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Somebody thinks of it, let me know.
like being like really like efficient and effective with our decisions. And I see it as maybe being a feedback loop where, you know, due to our climate action planning decisions, there are implications and, you know, focus areas that we can be sharing. Hey, you know, if we advocate for this, like housing transition or energy, like housing energy transition, then that also is going to, you know, be a recommendation to the infill, whatever, you know, if we have that open means of communication as to what they're doing and what we're
Right.
doing.
And that's the purpose of the navigation
Awesome.
meetings.
Yeah.
That's where we'll get into the nitty gritty of the historic preservation plan is recommending these materials. I'm totally an example, I'm making this up.
Yeah.
But the historic preservation plan is, you know, recommending this material and what's the embodied carbon if that becomes something material we want to talk about in the climate action plan.
Mhm.
Those trade-offs will be really what we're tackling in these meetings. Yeah.
I think for me, which I touched on a little bit, and I'll try to articulate the best I can. It's not 100% clarified in my own mind just yet. It's that community engagement piece, and the way I feel that it's so critical and would do well to somehow be incorporated into the climate action plan is that, you know, there's small groups of people working on a lot of these issues in little communities and in big governments and things, and it's slow, and our results need to be faster. And I feel like the more people we can educate and hit these like tipping points you're talking about, all of a sudden there's going to be this cascade effect of like solutions running rampant because of the power of consumer demand, because of the power of like popular public position and comment, voting power. And it's an issue in which individuals have the power to act. Of a lot of issues that are out there, like individuals in and of their own selves don't have a ton of influence unless they're like really, really loud and boisterous and have lots of time to, you know, get their voice out there a whole lot or something like that. And I also think that it's an opportunity to flip climate change from a like driven by like this doomsday, oh no, you know, we all feel guilty, let's act, into this like we can be proud of our community kind of a thing, and change things. And I agree with what I believe your philosophy might be around value systems changing. Took a class in economics and climate change, and there are some pretty convincing theories out there about how like really to overcome this in the long haul. And move this needle to where it needs to go, like some value systems have to change fundamentally. And that has to do with how we look at our communities, our economies, and all kinds of things. And that is about public opinion, public value systems. And so I think it's so easy for us, and I'm super guilty of it, just to go out and enjoy our lives and our days and just forget about all this stuff. So I think having some kind of a community engagement piece, in my mind at least, is a critical component.
So I want to differentiate for the group community engagement with the plan versus community engagement with the actual actions or alternatives that we recommend. Is that what you're speaking to, Nicole?
Yeah. Like a plan to, like some kind of steps to engage the community in the plan.
Yes.
Kind of going off what you were both saying earlier, I know one of the things you'll be talking about later is the idea of like calling out co-benefits, and I think also like synergies with other plans, but are there opportunities to identify like potential partnerships or be able to leverage resources like with regional partners or other organizations in the community? I think that would be great to call that out.
And I think that piece with resiliency really, that's really kind of a maybe county-wide, regional-wide aspect, right? Because so with regards to we can aim for greenhouse gas reduction like within the town limits, But then what do we do? Like, then there's another piece of how to adapt to climate change. It's happening, it's there, right?
Adaptation.
And so, and then I think that ties into the resiliency part of things. But then, like, you can't really do like an emergency planning just for the town of Crested Butte. I mean, you can, but it needs to be regional wide, right? So there's that, so I think that resiliency piece, we may need to branch out to, like what you're saying, working out with other partners
Yeah,
on creating that, and I don't know if that belongs into this plan or not, right? I don't know, I don't know.
thanks for raising that, Giza. We'll get into that kind of near the end of the presentation and what staff at least has kind of proposed for that resiliency piece and get your reactions on that. But so it's aligned with kind of what you're thinking about that regional approach.
So I don't know if it's like really in there, but I think having a further conversation about light pollution in the valley in terms of how it affects ecosystems, but also the glazing of historic buildings. And we just see more of that. And, you know, you can either, you know, Aspen recently put in a policy to have a lights out thing, and not that we need to do that, but something similar where like encourage people to at least close their blinds or have blackout blinds or something. Because I think we all live here because it's not really a city. We like seeing the stars and stuff. And so it's disappearing with every new build.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a good point of, are we just going to be, like, we're gonna be focusing on emissions, we're talking about like, you know, human health, like, you know, maybe like impacts to, environmental health, air quality, like beyond just emissions, so, yeah. One thing that I was, thinking about, but not just, regionally is if our decisions can have a link to, I don't know, like, you know, and even beyond our county, to like utility decisions and or state decisions, you know, if there is some sort of opportunity for connection and feedback there.
I'm hearing you maybe talk about like policy advocacy. I mean, I know that town staff were connected with CC4CA, which is a advocacy group that like helps smaller communities advocate for legislation up at the state and federal level. But that's an interesting,
Yeah.
Maybe on the flip side, you know, down the pipe, how can we like take best advantage of all the resources coming out there that seem hard to navigate?
Yeah. It's something that all.
And I feel
communities
like
are
that
struggling
ties a
with.
little bit into, I think what I'm talking a little bit about too, is in that community education, like really, I don't have the answers, but like really supporting people to take advantage of all these opportunities that are there, and the technologies are there, and the ideas are there. It's the implementation. And I think inspired communities can do a lot.
And this climate action plan, very similar to the 2019 climate action plan, it did a great job of laying out that roadmap of these are the material actions that we're prioritizing as a community and a roadmap to get there. So this climate action plan will do that by the end. That's my hope. If it doesn't, then we need to go back to the drawing board.
Something,
Yeah, of course. Sure.
I would like it clarify focus. I think a lot of plans get too big and you can't accomplish anything. There's a lot of planning going on that you have allies, and understanding your role in terms of climate action and relationship to preservation and relationship to transportation, and leveraging them to say your message, and instead of maybe a framework for resiliency, then establish a resiliency plan and really hone your message. Because the strides and the step you need to be in every planning initiative, from can't even remember the term, smart growth, integrated planning, it's all the same thing. So we've been doing this for 40 years in the planning profession. And I think the problems, the most successful ones, the problem ones are the ones that dreamed too big, because society, government, resources don't know how to tackle them. Versus if you give a focus and tie it to a big picture, but focus and leverage this with the other plans. So I just want to make sure you fine tune your message. So is my biggest hope.
Thanks, Troy.
But I wanted to talk about scope 3 emissions.
Oh, gosh.
my gosh.
This is like,
Go big.
I think that's the
That's
opposite of
why
what you
we're
just
here.
said.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that in the greenhouse gas emissions piece. but go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know, and I don't even know where I'm really going in my brain, but I just think of the resiliency piece of a plan and looking at, you know, that things are finite, but we don't treat them as finite. And so is there a space that's just, but it feels very cultural, and so I'm not really sure if it's appropriate of like reducing our dependency generally, like reducing our use of things, you know, which would then be more resilient when we have less access to things. And I think that gets into the scope 3 of greenhouse gas emissions, so.
Okay.
That's the opposite of what Troy said. That's just where my brain was at.
I think a good example though, sorry if there's still time for this to kind of bounce off what Troy said, is just being really disciplined when you get to the alternatives and things like that. Like what should be things this plan really works on, like programmatically or action steps, versus what can this plan really like advocate and empower the other plans to push for. So an example could be how like getting people to live closer where they work would really impact the amount of vehicles and save occupancy vehicle use and emissions from cars. But instead of this plan really focusing on like, how do we do a huge campaign on carpooling and this, would it be better spent like empowering the infill plan to really push having more people live in town near where they work? So how can we try to keep that framework and stay disciplined as we get into the later parts of the planning process?
And I want to bring us up a little bit back to the 30,000 foot view and recognize that we aren't going to answer all of our alternatives today, and the success measures that we define will really help us narrow in the scope, because when we figure out what the guardrails of our actions that we're proposing are, we can really define what's valuable to our community, what's valuable to the plan, and kind of scratch off the list what might be too lofty, what's not feasible by 2030, which is really what this plan looks at.
Sorry, can I throw out one?
Yeah, one last
'Cause
comment, and
only
then
because
we'll
this comes up in Bozar a lot, is irrigated lawns and green space.
Thank you.
And zero
I was gonna say,
scaping
nobody
and-
brought up water yet, and I'm actually
Yeah,
surprised.
and just having some tools to like address that. That is every project that comes through. There's a discussion on that.
Okay, thanks for bringing that up for me. Okay, we're gonna move on because we're running a little bit behind. We've got a little bit of content to get through before Terry jumps in with our high-level greenhouse gas emissions inventory results, which I'm also reacting to for the first time. These are, as they said, hot off the press. So before we dive into the greenhouse gas emissions reduction discussion, I wanted to just contextualize for folks who haven't been through the CAPC process before where we're headed in our decision making. So there's 5 steps to the CAPC, and they're all listed here. I won't read them out to you. The first 2 we've really kind of defined already. I'll say step 2, we're still working on some community engagement strategies, but we're defining the challenge. We're looking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and whatever salient topics that come out of this committee. When we talk about the success measures, the way I've been kind of framing that in my mind is our and also. So when we set the success measures, we are establishing guardrails around the things that we're proposing. Like I said, those will help really bring to the top what's material and what's feasible for our community based on what we propose and the impact it'll have on our greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And also help us create alternatives that are Crested Butte appropriate, right? We're focused on the CAPC, and those CAPC lay out our values of bold, accountable, connected, and authentic. And setting measures that allow us to prioritize those actions is going to be really important. So that's the and also. So just an example off the top of my head is, let's say one of our alternatives is implementing an environmental purchasing or sustainable building material policy. It's very vague for a reason, just a wild example. We look to our success measures that we've already established to say, and also this measure does this, because we've identified that as important. That'll really help us define those alternatives a lot better. And then for just a moment, I want to focus on step 5, which is making decisions based on informed consent. And I want to be clear that this is different than consensus. We will all not agree on what leaves this room and is what is put in the plan. But we will understand why those decisions are made. So that's the goal of the compass and really what that looks like in our decision-making frameworks. Next slide, Imogen. Thank you. I won't belabor this slide, but just wanted to really quick remind you all of the project timeline that I presented to council, just so you know where we're headed before the end of the year. Next slide. Okay, really quickly, I'm going to spend like 5 minutes on this and just talk to y'all about the high-level climate action plan progress, just so you have a sense of what we've already done. So as we think about alternatives, you can either think about how we can go deeper in some of these sectors or just fresh new ideas. So out of the 77 committed actions that were listed in the 2019 Climate Action Plan, 64% of them are either completed, are partially in progress, or ongoing, meaning that they've started and there's really no like completion date for that project. It's something we've implemented into perpetuity, air quotes. Next slide. And that is very small on the screen, I apologize. But this slide is really just to create an infographic for you to help you understand where we've made the biggest strides and where we have lots of room for improvement as far as of 2023. So we've made the most significant progress under building energy use and renewable energy, which is great because as the grid gets greener, so does all of the things that we use that are electric. And we've got some ways to go on waste reduction and transportation. Next slide, sorry. Just wanted to highlight some of the major projects under each sector. So under renewable energy, since 2019, we've put solar arrays on town-owned properties. We have initiated the OV Joyful Solar Array, which in previous lives has been called the Avalanche Park or the Sunshine Park Solar Array project. We have utilized renewable energy credits or GCA. At one point, it was for all electric consumers in the boundary of Crested Butte. And the Taylor River Hydro Dam was something we were supporting GCA in doing, and they are, if I remember right, anticipating completion of construction by the end of this summer. Is that right? Megan, you read the meeting. Okay, by the end of the summer, maybe fall. I'll double check on that. Next slide. Under building use, applause to Mel and Troy for getting the 2021 IECC building codes established and some all-electric standards. We have successfully implemented the Green Deed program, which Gisa would love to tell you all about, and I can too, which is energy efficiency projects for any deed-restricted homes in the town of Crested Butte, and just general energy efficiency improvements for town-owned buildings. Under transportation, like I said, these are kind of the lightweight categories. So we implemented public charging in 2020. For the most part, there was, I think, one station prior to that. And we're continuing to electrify our fleet. Next slide. And under waste, we did do a few things. We switched to single stream recycling, which actually increases participation. There was a composting feasibility study done, and we've done some work just this year around our zero waste special events requirements and kind of rebuffed that program a little bit. So more to come on that because that just kicked off this year. Next slide. Okay. I am now going to hand it over to the Brendel team to start the discussion around our greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. And I'll let them take it away.
Thank you, Dana. So I think this is a little bit repetitive of what we've already said before around the timeline, but just to remind you that we're kind of right at the beginning of this climate action plan development. And so we're in this phase one, defining the challenge and goal statement. And we were referencing the compass when we see that the challenge is to act on the urgency of climate change and prepare for the changes we expect from it. And as we've heard a little bit, the sort of main focus of this climate action plan is to do our part to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the first part of that overarching challenge statement. But we also have in mind the second part around preparing for the challenges we know are coming and becoming more resilient. So we will revisit that a little bit later in the presentation, but just thinking about kind of the interplay between those two. We also looked to the compass and saw kind of the definition of the complexity of the challenge. And so we're thinking about this as a complex challenge. So while I think somebody mentioned that, we've known about climate change for a long time, we kind of know what the actions are to reduce emissions, but finding the most appropriate path based on Crested Butte's unique set of values and characteristics is a complex challenge. So balancing different priorities and thinking about how to do this in the near term. And so we're right in this beginning piece, and we think that defining the challenge and goal setting approach is going to be important to coming up with kind of that goal statement for the plan. So just to set the stage a little bit with the understanding the scale of the challenge. So we are developing a 2022 greenhouse gas emissions inventory that will characterize and quantify existing community and municipal emissions. So the community inventory is all emissions within the Town of Crested Butte town limits, and then the municipal inventory is sort of a subset of that, which is emissions associated specifically with municipal government facilities and operations. It sounds as though many of you are familiar, at least to some extent, with greenhouse gas emissions accounting. So this may be redundant, but just to kind of describe the scope of the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, we are looking at greenhouse gas emissions by sector, so energy use, transportation, waste, and also by scope. So scope 1 emissions from sources located within the town boundary, so thinking transportation, fuel use, natural gas. Scope 2 are emissions associated with grid supplied electricity. And then scope 3 are other greenhouse gas emissions occurring outside of Crested Butte as a result of activities taking place within the town. This diagram just shows kind of that same information in a graphic format, showing the difference between scope 1 is kind of that within boundary things. Scope 2 is sort of the bridge where it's grid supplied electricity being used inside the town, but generated elsewhere. And then scope 3 is these emissions that are occurring outside of the boundary as a result of activities inside. So we thought it would be helpful just to reflect really quickly on the 2017 greenhouse gas emissions inventory before we launch into kind of an update of where we're at with the 2022 inventory. So the 2017 inventory kind of included these scope 1 and 2, which were the focus of the 2019 climate action plan. And you can see that the biggest sectors here are residential buildings, commercial buildings, and then surface travel, with some other smaller contributions from water, wastewater, and waste landfilling. We've already heard a little bit of conversation about scope 3, but the 2017 inventory did also quantify some emissions from fuel refining, food production, and cement production. And we can have a conversation, I think, in a bit about kind of to what extent those are included in a greenhouse gas emissions goal, to what extent they're tracked as meaningful emissions for the community. The 2017 inventory also included a forecast of emissions. So this just shows the results from that inventory looking at 2017 and then 2030. And we included this partly just to say, think about what the typical emissions trends are in communities that we're seeing across the board and might expect to see in Crested Butte before we go into some of the results that we're seeing in the preliminary 2022 inventory. So generally we see electricity has reduced emissions due to the emissions factor change. So that's thinking about even if the total amount of electricity used is staying similar or even increasing, the emissions associated with electricity are generally decreasing across the board as the percentage of renewable generation that goes into that supply increases. Natural gas on a one-off kind of year by year comparison is a little bit more nuanced just because it's so heavily dependent on weather. So when we've only got 2 years of comparison data, it's going to be important to kind of look at what the weather patterns were, what the differences were between the 2 years and make that comparison. But generally, natural gas tends to be kind of steady or slightly increasing. Transportation, we generally see as relatively stable. These are kind of often changing in line with population change, unless there's been kind of significant efforts or changes between. And then the same for water, wastewater, and waste. And so with that in mind, and before we kind of share the results that we have so far, just a kind of acknowledgement that we're about 70% complete with the 2022 inventory. So we have data for the largest emission sources from 2017 for transportation and energy use, which is what we'll focus on for today. We're currently missing some of the historically smaller emission sources, such as wastewater and some transit uses. So we'll be able to share those, I think, during our next meeting when we have kind of a more polished final inventory. And we're also going to highlight today some potential methodology changes since 2017, kind of look at where either the best practices or the data availability has changed between 2017 and 2022, and think about which methodology makes sense to use for this inventory. We'll be probably recommending methodologies that prioritize simplicity of tracking and calculation so that the city can continue to track data that's comparable year on year going forward. And then also the ability to measure change resulting from actions under local control. So where possible, that means using more local data sources that are reflecting kind of actual conditions on the ground, and therefore reflecting the impact of actions and activities that are taking place as a result of the climate action plan, rather than kind of state level or even national level standard data that's kind of scaled down, or even county that's scaled down to the community scale. So we'll start with electricity, and you'll notice that we're not sharing today the kind of high level emissions totals or comparing the emissions across different sectors. We'll be able to do that at our next meeting once we've got 100% of the data and also kind of confirmed some approach questions that we have for this group today. But you can see that between 2017 and 2022, the total electricity use is actually relatively stable. So there's a very slight increase, and most of that is coming from the residential sector. In the commercial and industrial sector, in 2017, municipal wasn't separated out. So we're kind of comparing the commercial and industrial total in 2017 to the commercial and industrial plus municipal in 2022 for that comparison. And you can see there's been also a decrease, a slight decrease in the commercial and industrial use. This data is using GCEA electricity data, so using those kind of actual kilowatt hours used in the community. And you can see that the emissions factor between 2017 and 2022, kind of in line with what we would expect, given the changing grid, has reduced. So just know that per kilowatt hour, the emissions associated with electricity use has gone down. Moving on to natural gas, and Terry or Shelby, feel free to jump in. I'm just going to keep whistling through otherwise for now. Kind of similar, so this data is based on actual Atmos energy gas data, reflecting usage inside the community. You can see there's a relatively significant increase here in the total usage, and particularly in the residential sector. So again, the commercial and industrial were not separated out from the municipal. So when you're comparing the commercial and industrial from 2017 to 2022, including the municipal, it's about 51,000 compared to 55. So still an increase there, but not as significant as that increase that we're seeing in residential. There's also been a slight change in the emissions factor that we're seeing as kind of the best practice emissions factor to use for natural gas. This doesn't tend to change anywhere near as much as the emissions factor for electricity, just because there aren't those changes with the increase in renewable supply. For on-road transportation, I think this is one that we can talk through some of the methodology questions in a second, but just to note that there is different methodologies being used right now between 2017 and 2022. So this big number in the 2017 inventory is based on a scaled down estimate I think based on population of regional VMT on highway miles only using a publicly available state tool. In 2022, we received some data from the city that was developed as part of the transportation plan that showed trips on segments throughout the community. And from that, we were able to get to a VMT that should account for all the streets within the community based on that streetlight data. And I think we can kind of dig in a little bit more to the differences in the methodology and what makes the most sense going forward and why we might be seeing such a huge difference between those two numbers. For 2022, because we're breaking out the municipal emissions, we also have the municipal fuel use for gasoline and diesel. We don't have a comparison from 2017, but just know that will be part of the municipal inventory. For solid waste, we're seeing an increase, a pretty significant increase in the total tons of solid waste and the total tons of recycling. This is based on data from Waste Management. I think the approaches are the same between the 2 years for collecting the data. Right now, we are seeing a difference in the emissions factor. And so I think that's something, again, that we can talk a bit in a second when we get to the discussion. But the emissions factor that was used in 2017 is different, is significantly different from the kind of EPA best practice emissions factor that we're seeing now. And so there may just be some decisions to be made about kind of how comparable the total emissions data will be from 2022 compared to 2017.
Imogen, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Were you all able to include the maintenance company's composting data under the waste section, or are we still just looking to do that? Or was it so minimal?
Terry, I don't know if you can, yeah, go ahead, Terry.
Yeah, the composting data is included in the tool today. Right now, it's not considered. We're sort of using that as more of an illustrious data point, as opposed to something that would impact the emissions inventory. Essentially, this is where you take solid waste minus that recycling bit to get to kind of what would be landfilled and therefore have emissions associated with it.
Are biosolids included in that?
No, I have not included in that, but. Terry Shea was asking whether biosolids, we compost our biosolids in some of Mount CB's. Is that right?
We take all of Mount CB's, we try and compost as much as we can, and then we
Okay.
landfill the rest.
Yeah. This might be something just a note.
I think data points like that are helpful from a storytelling perspective of kind of actions that are being taken that reduce this total emissions number. And I think especially in future years, as you get more and more kind of comparable years of data, maybe looking at, okay, the solid waste decreased by this, can that partly be explained by the recycling or the composting increasing that's helping to avoid emissions? We wanted to pause here, and we've kind of put all of our questions on one slide. So just let me know if it'd be helpful to flip back to any of the previous slides with the data included. But I might just start with the first one. So for the electricity and natural gas, for both of the utilities, we saw a pretty significant increase in the residential usage. We were just curious if you have any thoughts as to why that might be, if that kind of resonates with what you're seeing locally in terms of maybe development or residential sort of use of energy in the community.
We can share with you the building permits approved. None of the buildings that are constructed between 2017 and 22 are all electric. They're natural gas. We're just now seeing the first electric buildings getting COs now, so that's not in the data. So we can give you building permit growth, predominantly residential. I would say still low in terms of total growth, but we'll give those to you so you can, that helps. There is growth in residential units.
Was that like a 20% increase though?
Yeah.
We haven't had 20% more buildings.
Oh, no,
Well-
it's not that big.
Yeah.
Growth.
So what comes to mind is, is there the ability to get, say, square footage of residential housing in 2017 versus 2022?
Easy.
To look at more of like an intensity factor versus just
Well,
all.
most of our units are, the
Absolute.
growth are the same size.
They're all the same size.
They're all
yeah.
the same size. We
Everybody
really
maxes
limit
out.
building size.
Well, that's more when I say like, so total square footage of like residential, all residential housing and all commercial buildings. So that you're looking at intensity decrease or increase versus just absolute, that might be.
Yeah, we have all sorts of ways to show what has grown from what has been approved and developed. But as Dara
Okay.
said, it's not 20%.
Yeah, great, that's,
But they have elevators and things.
and
Some
that
of
would,
them do.
that would-
Some of them do.
and that's exactly why you do something like that, is
Yeah.
it's like, okay, well, the electricity usage per square foot has gone up or not, you know?
And it's gonna go up a lot more with
As we go
electrification.
Mhm.
I was
electric. The gas
thinking of
increase.
the natural gas increase. Electricity, I thought, stayed relatively flat. Did I see that right?
There is a little
No.
decrease or increase in residential.
Little one.
Yeah, relatively flat. Where natural gas shot up.
Let me make sure Atmos isn't including aperture. in that response.
Yeah, we want to make sure you have
Like all
our
glass
boundaries,
buildings.
our boundaries correct too, because there's some really big non-town regulated buildings that are very close.
Do we also, in that time frame, have like our peak tourist visitor numbers ever in
That's a
history?
good point.
2017 versus 2020.
It's like somewhere in those
2022.
years was like more people have visited this.
I
place,
think that was
than ever.
I think
Well,
that was
people-
21.
But then I
20,
think
21,
during like
22.
2019, 2020, I looked at like the graph. Those.
And that was-
numbers is way
Yeah, that
down.
was flat.
Is this the year of 2022?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
Okay, it's
Calendar
not
year.
the 3 year, okay,
Right.
so it
Yeah.
doesn't include like
so,
It's a
whatever was
snapshot of
staying
one
home.
year.
Okay.
Right.
so that'd be another beneficial metric to look at is like population, both of the town in those 2 years, and also maybe like tourist numbers. You know, to be not just looking at absolute emissions, but intensity, maybe emissions per like tourist visited or emissions per resident might be a beneficial
We did,
insight.
we did provide tourism counts.
Okay.
For the year 2022, TAP was able to provide that to us.
Great.
I don't know, Terry, if you want to speak to how that was incorporated or wasn't.
Yeah, so far we're collecting that again more from a sort of a benchmarking perspective to have some similar metrics to the 2017 inventory. I think with respect to the natural gas use, one piece that we haven't mentioned and we will be looking into but haven't yet is the change in the weather data between these two specific years, and that could play a significant change or a significant role in the change of use. Knowing that at least from census data, there doesn't seem to be a significant increase in population over the time. That's, I think weather might be playing a role here.
Don't know if this is relevant for this community or not, but is other than the tourism numbers, I wonder do you think there might be any other kind of pandemic impact where the second home owners who were previously spending most of their time elsewhere, who are now spending most of their time in Crested Butte because they did through the pandemic and now they can work remotely? I don't know if that's a significant percentage, but it's something I've heard elsewhere.
That was a question we had at the beginning of
We
like how do
didn't
remote workers.
Our data,
There's a-
that's anecdotal. So our data, we do a housing census every 2 years. And we did not see a change in second homeowner occupancy in the last 4 years. And we're doing another census right now, which I do question the methodology of the census we did 2 years ago. And the motivation of staff at the time. I know this one will be more reliant. Our hope is to get that done when now?
April.
So April, so I can't, yes, I think that's a valid hypothesis. We have no data to verify it,
When you say occupancy, Troy, do you mean full-time occupancy?
that they're in there more, right? Our way to track it,
Yeah.
unless we can get individual electricity, we have no data to verify.
I would imagine too that people working from home are like maybe cranking their heat more because they're at home rather than being in an office. Where there's a whole bunch of people in one
That's a good
building.
point.
I did when I worked.
I did
My
from
too,
home.
house is very cold when I'm not
Yeah,
home.
yeah.
Okay, I'm going to keep us moving through these questions, and we maybe can kind of tackle them as a bunch too. But for the on-road transportation, where we saw that significant, like very significant difference in the number, that's probably primarily driven by the change in methodology. Just wondering if this group has any thoughts on the approach that makes the most sense for data availability and replicability. We really want to pick a methodology that A, kind of reflects change locally, but also B, is easy for the city to track or for the town to track on an ongoing basis.
So I missed, I'm sorry, the first methodology of 2017. I obviously know the 22 methodology. Could you repeat the 17 again? I'm sorry.
So I believe it was using county level data for highway miles or kind of major road miles scaled down to the town level
Yeah,
based on
that
population.
methodology is incorrect. I just would not use it
Yeah, that's
because
pretty
it's
suspect.
taking a vehicle-based trip that we know there's a higher percentage of trips in vehicles from the county and on the highway network. In the town, we have an absurdly high pedestrian and bicycle trip use. The streetlight data is easy for the town to replicate and much more accurate on town I don't see the logic of taking county travel behaviors into a very pedestrian first town. The streetlight data is much more accurate.
And I think Mel had mentioned that we were exploring continuing streetlight at a regional level, so that, cost sharing of the subscription.
We're considering it. Yeah.
We're going to ask our partners if they'll
Right.
partner with us.
It's not super expensive, but it is a big ask for the town to keep it annually.
How does the streetlight data, just
You-
real, it knows where the cars are coming? I mean, I thought it was
It
just.
knows where the cell phones are.
So where they
It's the same
actually
as
keep.
So
track.
does it, if there's two
Okay.
cell phones in a car, how does it,
It counts
it
as
just,
two.
That's one trip, right?
It
That'd
counts
just be
as
one.
two.
Oh, really? Oh.
so that doubles the
But they
vehicle
have,
mileage?
they have filters and transportation. They know if you're on a bike, if you're walking, if you're in a bus.
Mm.
We paid for walk, bike, car. We didn't count bus. It's a more refined, much more expensive. So they have a way to determine vehicle occupancy and relate it back to trips.
Okay, so it goes
So
bound to that
They'll
one
give us
car's
a vehicle
mileage.
occupancy and trips. So they will take a single car, but they will count both phones, but they'll know if it's a single trip.
And so this 2022 data is all the miles on all the town street roads within the
All the
boundary.
streets within the town. So we have segments in streetlight that has a number, ADT, and they took those numbers and the length of the segments to determine.
I mean, that seems pretty accurate.
It's
if
very
you're willing to
accurate.
keep paying
It's
for
as
it.
accurate as you can get.
How do you differentiate between like passenger vehicles and, how many people are in the vehicle versus like, tractor trailers and,
Well, a tractor trailer is a trip.
right, so I guess that's how but it obviously has like higher emissions than a vehicle,
Sure,
which
and
is
you're-
the end goal.
We
And I
don't
think
have,
that would be
there's
where,
no
like,
data source to get
Okay.
to that level. What they typically
Okay.
use is VMT.
Mhm.
And they take the average trip. So we know 5 to 10% of the trips are freight,
Okay,
right?
okay,
We know
so you're
each trip of the
building,
types, and I would defer to Imogene on
okay,
how emissions are determined, but VMT is typically the starting point.
yes. Yep.
And I would just go with streetlight.
I don't want to
Yeah.
get too in the weeds on
And to be
streetlights.
honest, we can,
That's
we
okay.
can go back in time to 2017 and do the streetlight analysis,
Sweet.
if we have our subscription.
Yeah,
So they can go back in time and capture it.
cool. That was gonna be my other question. Sorry. We know where you were.
Yeah,
I know where you were.
yeah.
So Imogen, I think we've established that streetlight is locally appropriate and way more accurate. Can we move on to solid waste and more particularly scope 3?
Well, I'm gonna
Yeah.
pause for a second. So those are just the trips in town or the ADT on our streets. Right, it's not trip length, so we have a lot of people commuting from Gunnison or on House, so that VMT is strictly within our town boundaries. Clearly, the town impacts more than that,
That's scope 3.
right? The
Mhm.
length of the
That's
trip,
scope 3.
right? So
Yeah, those are scope 3 considerations.
that's really the transportation master plan.
Go ahead, Imogen.
So just real quick before we go on to scope 3, the solid waste, I think probably the solid waste and recycling increases, maybe when we start looking into the electricity and natural gas, if we're seeing some patterns in population or things like that, the solid waste and recycling tend to be tied fairly closely to population. So we can look into that and then think about whether there's any other reasons why we might be seeing those increases, unless anyone has a kind of light bulb moment now as far as why the numbers might have increased.
Back to like the COVID changes, like you were saying, working at home, all the takeout, like
tourism,
non-reusable things,
Mhm.
visitation.
Tourism was up for sure.
Yeah, like has that had a significant impact?
I
Does the
think-
town track demolition permits?
Yes.
Yes.
'Cause that would be another, if we're getting other building permit data, that would be an interesting thing to just check.
Yeah, that's good.
I think tourists use more waste. Just because of the nature that they're moving, they're eating out, they buy tons of stuff that's packaged, that gets unpackaged here and thrown away. So the more tourists, the more waste.
And wasn't there a lot more like home projects going on? Like, like during or after COVID, like there was a lot of, that kind of smaller remodeling things within people's homes going on too.
Can you go back to that slide, Imogen?
Yeah, and just to remember, we're looking at 2022, so the COVID impacts are probably still a thing, but not as much as we would have if we were looking at 2020 or 21.
Yeah, I wonder what the exponential increase is in like Amazon purchases and trash from that.
Yeah, I think
Huge.
Did waste management give you the data commercial versus the residential route?
No.
No, they do not. They don't differentiate.
That would be interesting.
I mean, I just don't know if we can get it if waste management isn't tracking.
They're tracking residential, so if they were total and they have residential, they should have.
I'll have to look. I think I
They
asked
give us
them,
our residential reports monthly, right?
but I think it's on the same route. I don't know. Let me follow up with them on that because I asked about that and they seemed like they couldn't get it.
Because with the commercial numbers going down for utility usage, I just wonder, right, is it because remodeling or demolitions would be captured in the commercial use versus the
Yeah.
residential use? Just to get those
What is
shorter
commercial like?
Dumpsters, anything that's not single family duplex.
So even if it gets taken to like the county landfill? Like
Yeah, but
demolition,
waste management, so this probably, I don't know if this includes Golden Eagle, but we do have Golden Eagle waste as well.
yeah, because that's like
management
construction
takes
waste,
Pretty much all of it out of the count.
right? So if a construction company uses Golden Eagle for a roll-off, it's not in there.
Yeah. But we have a lot of we have a lot of waste management dumpsters as the town. Right?
I think it would be really interesting to see some of these same statistics on similar tourist towns and just see how we're trend with other tourist towns.
Inventories.
Per capita or something.
Just because, and then I think that we might see some trends and be like, well, that's COVID, because a lot of the same things happen in a lot of different ski towns.
And then you can isolate like what is maybe market driven and what is, maybe more unique factors that, are happening here that we can address.
Terry, is there anything on the emissions factor change that would be worth discussing now for the solid waste?
I think right now, at least for 2022, we're using a national EPA factor for 100% mixed solid municipal solid waste. So I haven't been able to track the source for the 2017 emissions factor. So I'm not sure why there's such a huge difference between those two. But given that we did a little bit of a review of studies that have happened to kind of break down what makes up the waste, what characterizes the waste, and led us to the conclusion to use that national factor.
Terry, would you be able to share, was Western involved with that 2017 emissions inventory?
Yes, they did it.
I might have access to that emissions factor.
Okay.
Source.
Yeah, just to understand where it came from would be helpful.
Or if we have just the amount of waste, we can use the current emissions factor and backtrack the
But
trend.
who knows where it came from?
Would
You know,
amount
the
of
emissions
food?
factor source.
Right.
You know, the actual emissions factor source.
Yeah, but if we ignore the 2017, because we don't know where it came from, and use the 2022 for everything going forward, we can apply the 2022 to the amount of
Yeah.
waste in 2017 and
Mhm.
see the trend.
And maybe the source of 2017 is irrelevant if we don't know where it came from.
I
Yeah.
wonder if they, because it's so much higher, if they took into account how far our waste is hauled. Because it goes to Montrose at a minimum, if not GJ.
Mhm.
It's a particularly long haul. More than normal, yeah, I think.
Yeah, and versus a national factor. That's a really good point.
I don't know, Western may have taken that into account. or
Yeah.
tried to.
I was wondering the same thing, and I think if we could track down the source of that emissions factor and any kind of other assumptions that went into it, that would be really helpful. Okay, let's open the scope 3 box. So I think the question here is, I think, around what is most important to track and what is kind of meaningful to track and measure. And I think, so we talked about previously in the 27 inventory looked at, I think, fuel refining, cement production, and food. And there are some, like, we could look at those scope 3 emissions from kind of a storytelling perspective of what's changed. Most of the calculation was done using kind of state or census data and a kind of state or federal or national standard information. So there's a question, I think, about how much the metrics that were available will reflect kind of local action. And so yeah, I might just kind of pose the question of what to this group as far as scope 3, so that again, those are the emissions that are occurring outside of town boundaries as a result of activities within the town. What of those is kind of most important to track?
Now, I'll add to this that we are looking at airport and how to best contribute that to CB and Mount CB, that being a destination. And also RTA technically would be a scope 3 because they're not within our boundary of town, but we are bringing their services to town. So just want to note that.
And again, Terry or Shelby, feel free to jump in also.
So you were saying the streetlight data, if someone's driving from Gunnison into the town, is that considered scope 3 and is that?
Technically, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Because that would be interesting unless, of course, the county is doing their own and they're looking at that from the county level, but if they're not, I mean, I feel like any of those traveling into the town, which we know comes
Yeah.
out of town so much, is meaningful.
It is absolutely from a transportation
Yeah.
strategy, because our region, we're such an employment center, how the employees get here
Yeah.
is critical to our understanding, working with RTA and CDOT.
I think that would be an interesting one with the crossover of the plans. It would be interesting for this plan to quantify that GHG impact and then look to the transportation, not spend time trying to solve it.
Yeah.
With
Oh, I
part of
see.
this,
Look at
we look to the transportation mobility plan for the solution, right?
Yes.
I wonder,
And what are offered?
maybe,
What are offered?
oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I can't see everyone, so apologies if I'm jumping over people. I think that is potentially kind of like a blending of the previous methodology for transportation and then the new methodology, where some of the VMT that might have been kind of maybe misleadingly included as scope 1 in the previous inventory is actually scope 3 for this inventory, where it's vehicle miles traveled happening in the county.
It could be, but we can get that data from streetlight.
Okay.
Because we know how many employees come in from Gunnison. We know how many come in from CB South or the mountain. Streetlight tells us the origin and destination of every trip. So we can get the average trip length as well as VMT. We just have to resubscribe.
I mean, but I
ask
think
those
the
questions.
question is whether we take responsibility for those emissions or if we treat them, which we still take responsibility for scope 3, but it's how we address
Yeah.
the actions of those emissions. So that's the question, as opposed to like whether we can get the data. It's how are we scoping that data? Which bucket will it fall into? And that will inform how we approach it.
Well, I'll just tell you what the transportation plan is doing, so you can decide how the bucket works. Right, we need to reduce the number of trips, increase vehicle occupancy, which is not the same thing. Shorten the average trip length, and increase transit ridership, right? And so our metrics are gonna be towards ridership. And hopefully decreasing ADT, or at least stabilizing it, because it's been growing at 2.5 a year. And so we're focused on trips from a transportation, that's easily translatable to emissions.
Yes.
Yeah, so I wonder, Dana, does it make sense to include them as scope 3, but recognize that they're being generated because of us, right? Which is what scope 3 means,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
absolutely proactively trying to
Yeah,
address them.
yeah.
But
I
just not
mean,
coming
it
up with
says
those
we need to
solutions.
fund
Right.
and help RTA help us.
I could tie back to that kind of storytelling you were talking about with composting or other things of how we recognize like we are accountable to those emissions, but explain why some are attributed to scope 3 versus 1.
And I think it's helpful too, because I know Vail is not tracking scope 3 emissions in theirs, so if the town does it, that could be really useful. Especially because
We could provide them their scope.
Yeah. Yeah, Bill was
What about construction traffic? Related to
yeah.
our community, and I don't just mean like the dump trucks coming in and out of town, right? They gotta go to Gunnison to go get gravel, they gotta go to Gunnison to get concrete, they gotta go to Gunnison to get asphalt. What about those batch plants themselves, and the GHG emissions that are coming off those plants? That there's for us.
And
The
this
traffic is
this
captured.
where scope 3 gets messy. You're asking the right question.
But our traffic can capture it. Right, we'll know if they're coming into town. We won't know if it's a construction truck, but we know it's a vehicle.
But
So
I think
maybe
there's
so.
a big difference between a car driving into town and a dump truck driving 60 miles back and forth from.
So that all being said, this might be a good opportunity then to, just so that we're comparing apples to apples, and I think this is where the next bullet point is going. Maybe draw a boundary that might be bigger for both 2017 and 2022 if transportation is of such focus and interest, because maybe our in-town population hasn't changed, but the population serving the community has. Maybe more people could live here in 2017 than can live here now. Maybe more businesses could exist here versus can exist here now. And so we're still serving the same community very differently, perhaps, but until we have that, like that standardized data between the two, we were only like surmising what might have happened. Because if we just say, okay, well, our boundaries emissions haven't really gone up, well, is that really telling the whole story? Yeah.
It'd be hard to quantify.
But it might
Yeah,
not,
exactly.
but it might not, like you're saying, if we can, and I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but if we can get the data from 2017 pretty easily and want to use 2017 as a baseline year, then we might have that opportunity. So, yeah.
I think we have 15 minutes and a whole lot of stuff to get through that we may not make it through everything, but I think this baseline year conversation could be one that we can revisit as a project management team and also potentially at our next meeting once we have kind of the full picture of emissions. I think based on this really helpful discussion today and I think we have some kind of guidance on some of the decisions around emissions methodology and sources. And then once we have those kind of other few missing pieces of data too, and we have a clearer picture of what the comparison looks like, I think maybe we revisit that question then, if that makes sense to the group.
Thanks, Imogen.
And I would only say, if that is a question, like while you're gathering the data right now for 2022, would this be an opportunity that if you decide to use 2017 as a baseline year and update methodologies, potentially update the baseline to reflect the methodology used this time around, then you could be collecting both at the same time.
I think that, so that wasn't in our kind of original scope to sort of recreate the 2017 inventory. It might be a question about, maybe the template that we're creating, if the town can collect the data, it could be easily plugged in if it's comparable. But I think that might be a conversation that we need to have with Dana in a future meeting.
I think one of the reasons we would use a 2022 baseline over the 2017 would be if there were significant material changes between the 2 years.
Material,
Understanding that
methodology changes or that you.
material that like there were significant increases or significant decreases based on that year in certain sectors, that would really be the main driver to do that, but we'll discuss it.
Okay.
Go ahead, Imogen.
Okay. I'm going to whistle through these relatively quickly. I think the information was in the agenda that was sent out also, so we can reference that for additional information if helpful. But kind of taking the 2022 inventory, having, once we've defined the scale of the challenge using the inventory and compared that to 2017, if relevant, then we start thinking about, what the goal looks like to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to describe sort of three related approaches. So these first two are kind of taking a top-down big picture. What is the emissions reduction that is needed to kind of align with the level of ambition and the values of the town? So the first is alignment with the Mountain Towns 2030. I think that's already come up today, and it's a pact to achieve net zero emissions by 2030, and there's several other mountain communities that have aligned with this pact. The second sort of top-down way of goal setting is to set a science-based target. And so a science-based target will reflect Crested Butte's fair share of the reduction in global emissions needed to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. And establishing a net zero emissions target by 2050 or earlier. And once we have the final emissions inventory and kind of that total emissions, then we'll know what that fair share of reduction looks like. But it's likely in the 55 to 75% reduction by 2030, based on the type of community that Crested Butte is and what we're seeing so far in terms of the emissions. And kind of other considerations that go into this top-down emission setting. We've talked a bit about emission scope. So one approach is that you could track additional scope 3, but focus the goal setting on scope 1, scope 2, and some limited scope 3. So most communities are tracking waste as part of their emissions goals. And then also the contribution of offsets. So there's various different terms that are used when talking about emissions goals. One is net zero, which is often used interchangeably with carbon neutral. And this goal is kind of a state of balance when all greenhouse gas emissions released by human activities are counterbalanced by removing carbon from the atmosphere. And so the reason we lean towards net zero emissions rather than carbon neutral is just to reflect the inclusion of all emissions, not just carbon, so including methane and other sources in that kind of carbon dioxide equivalent is how it's tracked in emissions inventories. And then zero carbon is sometimes used interchangeably, but really means when no emissions are produced at all. So the difference being that this counterbalancing of removing carbon from the atmosphere. And so achieving net zero emissions typically involves getting as close to zero carbon as possible and offsetting the balance with carbon sequestration. So with activities that remove carbon from the atmosphere. And so when Crested Butte is thinking about what is our emissions goal, both of these things are important. So thinking about the scope and what's included in the goal, and then also thinking about whether there's any kind of maximum tolerance of offsets that are included in the goal, as well as any requirements on where those offsets come from or specific carbon sequestration projects. And this graph just shows sort of the net zero approach, so showing that you reduce emissions as much as possible and then use carbon removal approaches to offset the balance. And then the third goal setting approach, which is really kind of interlinked with the others, is this bottom-up action impact analysis. So I think it was Steamboat Springs used an approach of setting their emissions goal based on thinking about the actions that they can implement and the emissions impact of those actions. So there is an approach that the goal is developed through this kind of bottom-up analysis of the emissions impact of actions that are identified in the plan. I think this approach can also just tie in with the top-down approach. So we can think about what's the top-down approach at the beginning, what's the goal that we need to achieve in order to align with the kind of climate values of the community, and then cross-check that against the emissions impact analysis once we've identified the actions to see what's feasible and how far this gets the community towards the target that was identified. And so we wanted to just pause, and I think maybe Dana, I might look to you to see how you'd like to use the rest of the time that we have. I think we have this discussion around a working draft goal statement, and then we also had a potential discussion around resilience and how to include that in the climate action plan. And I think we have about 8 minutes, so I'm not sure if we have time to fully cover both of the discussions. I don't know if you have a preference.
Yeah, sorry, Imogen, I didn't mean to speak over you. I would like to focus on the greenhouse gas emissions piece, and then resiliency we can talk about at the next meeting. I think that's appropriate.
I think that makes sense. And also we've heard already some perspectives on resilience and thinking about it as a co-benefit and making sure it's included. So I think we can kind of take those for now and then dig a bit deeper during our next meeting. So to give some context on this discussion then, this is kind of a working draft or a placeholder goal statement based on by 2030, the community could set a goal to meet or exceed a science-based target that includes scope 1, 2, and waste, which is scope 3. And then by 2050 to achieve net zero emissions, including a related emissions goal, including potentially additional scope 3 if the community wanted to, and then also a definition around the requirements for offsets and maximum tolerance for offsets and carbon sequestration efforts. And I think the discussion is just if there are any questions or if this, how any reactions to this as a placeholder or a working draft goal statement that we could then revisit further along in the plan process once we have the emissions analysis for the action alternatives that are identified.
Maybe I'll kick this off by also contextualizing that if we set a science-based target, which is again that obligation of our emissions to keep 1.5 and under, it's a benchmark, right? At 2030, we can then evaluate, are we actually meeting these goals? Are we trajecting towards that net zero? And that can be a place where we can measure and reevaluate, but also aiming for net zero by 2050 or sooner, as Imogen said. So just want to throw that out there as a discussion topic. What's your initial reaction to this? We heard some feedback from council, and Beth, if you want to share that, I won't speak for you.
I think one of the things when you asked us with council is council didn't know what we were choosing between.
Mm-hmm.
And so while I know it always makes sense to set a goal first, I couldn't tell what the difference in our plan would be of net zero of 2030 versus net. The science base, yeah, right. We didn't really know what we were actually choosing between, so that's kind of the opinion that I was stuck on too.
What is your reaction seeing some of these preliminary kilowatt hours energy production since 2017? Do you have a change in opinion or not really?
No, because I think we still want to know, like, what are we choosing between actions wise? So
you prefer maybe the steamboat bottoms up? What can we do and what would that yield?
you know what, after sitting here, I was more, yeah, I mean, 2 weeks ago, that didn't make sense at all to me. And then listening to it all again and thinking about it again, it did. Because we want to know what we can do. Yeah.
I think that, I like that.
If you have other arguments, go ahead.
I have another idea. I do like the idea of, it's practical, it sets us up for success. I think you can mirror and match budget requirements and staffing requirements and stuff with action and then measuring the success of those actions. But I think, in my opinion, because of the critical need for this change, both locally and globally and everything else that everybody knows, so I won't go into it. It feels like the science-based approach, in my opinion, is almost more necessary because there's targets that have to be met and those are scientifically proven. And then we do our best to do the actions to meet those. I might see arguments for both, but I think because of the critical nature of this particular topic.
I'm curious and kind of the themes I heard at the beginning around the town being a model for the potential for that. I'm thinking of our values of accountable and bold. What would people think about like potentially 2 2030 goals of like a town municipal goal versus a community at large? Because I wonder if there's a chance to balance the like, we need to do this science-based community-wide, but we know that's going to be hard. Can we set a model and be really bold with our town actions? Okay.
I think we have to be bold with our actions. I think even discussing 2050 is kicking the can and allowing people more flexibility than we have. And so I think, if we make a science-based goals, let's make them to meet it net zero by 2030. I think we need to be very specific on what net zero means, what scopes in there. I'd like to include building materials in a scope 3, because I think that's easy to capture, like steel and concrete, super easy in building permits, just the amount of it. And those are big gorillas in building projects. Yeah, I don't see a point in waiting. If we can align with mountain towns too, I think it gives other, like, a coalition of groups that can share ideas more, so if we're all trying to meet the same goal.
I just echo a lot of the sentiments that I'm hearing of, I wouldn't want to set a goal without a plan. I wouldn't want to actually like publicly say, hey, here's our goal without how we're going to get there. And that's frankly like how even science-based target like evaluates the actual publication of science-based targets goals, is they look through how corporations are actually planning to do that. And they won't approve it unless it's got enough like detail behind it to back it up. So,
well, keep in mind, we're setting this goal to help drive the bus towards the alternatives we propose. And we'll be evaluating those alternatives later to say, we're way off base here and there's no way we can accomplish the goal that we've set. So we aren't setting numbers today. We aren't setting strict, like we're going to do 75% reduction by, we're trying to get some direction on how we can plug in those numbers, what folks are comfortable with offsets, because that's a huge piece of the discussion that we may have to push to next time, but understanding that net zero will likely include offsets, and really just getting a direction with which to go as we start to think about alternatives for next time. I like what Imogen says is that the bottom up approach is a piece of this goal setting, right? Like I don't want to repeat myself, but we want to set a direction. And then if we find later, there's no feasible way we can get there with what we're proposing, we can pivot.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think your goal is too precise. I kind of agree with Beth and the council, is it's setting a false expectation. We don't know how to get there. And that's sort of a falsehood of the planning process. I think the goal in the compass is to reduce greenhouse gases. What do you want success measures to be? Right? And then the success measures can break out waste, can break out transportation, can break out buildings. And then you can create alternatives that create different results. Are they hitting our success measures? I think the goal to reduce, I think you're getting so precise when you say a science-based or net zero. We can still maybe achieve them through the alternatives, but I think you're getting too detailed too soon. We need to go from the big picture to the solutions. And so I'm just worried that it's too precise, and we're going to have this debate with our elected officials, and they're our friends. let alone the community, which is really gonna get confused. They, well, how are we gonna get there? What does that mean to me? Versus success measures under the individual metrics of greenhouse gas. And let the alternatives drive the number.
I would argue and say that I don't agree, because if we don't set a metric, how do we know if we're being bold?
Right.
How do we know if
Agree
we're
with
being
that.
accountable?
Mhm.
That,
Well, I think
I
bold and
disagree.
accountable, two different things. And I think you're not being accountable.
well, if we
you know
don't
how
set
you
a
can achieve it.
science-based target, then we're not accountable.
Never said we're not gonna achieve that. Never once came out of my mouth.
I will
Maybe,
say-
maybe goal is not the right word. Maybe it can be, I don't know what the other word would be, but maybe it can be like something to strive for, to achieve what science is saying is necessary at this time for our local community, our global community to survive. There's like, it's not like we're being precise and trying to meet this exact number, but we're gonna strive. And here's the very best we can do.
It feels like those are alternatives. The net zero,
They're not.
the,
Well,
I
that's,
think
no,
they
They're
that's
are.
what,
stepping stones.
I think
Like
they are.
science-based, like
Well,
the
how are you gonna achieve it?
objective is,
But we haven't defined that yet.
and then I
We're
think
not,
that
we're
is,
just
a-
not there in the process
Right,
yet.
we're,
I think like, when the council discussed it, that was the problem.
Yeah.
Is the council felt like it was, alternative.
I followed up.
And that it would change, if we picked Mountain Towns 2030, this versus science-based goals, that would change what we put in the plan, because they're stepping stones. But I don't feel like, I don't feel that I know what those differences are, and I wanna put everything on the table to get it, reduce our GHG emissions as fast as possible, no matter which of those we set.
Yeah.
can I just say, we have another meeting in here, like right now.
Oh, okay.
So it's Habitat for Humanity.
Yeah.
Are you in this meeting too?
Yeah.
Well, I'll just wrap up by saying, we'll just take kind of the base discussion that we had, and I apologize, we didn't really get too into the weeds on it, but we'll try to summarize the notes for next time and have a little bit more of a robust discussion when we meet again in April, and then we will have that final greenhouse gas emissions inventory too, so that'll be helpful. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
We're gonna
Thank
adjourn. Sorry.
you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.